So Warzone is now 3 years old. Yesterday marked 3 years exactly. March 10th, 2020, Warzone launched, changing the entire trajectory for the better or for worse, depending on who you ask, of the entire Call of Duty franchise. Warzone wasn't the first entry into the Battle Royale for the franchise. That came in the form of Blackout the year prior, and unbeknownst to a lot of people, Sledgehammer was toying with a small-scale last man standing mode that never really made it to live but was in the game files. No, Warzone wasn't the first, but it was the project that got the resources and the marketing to be the biggest, and not just for the Call of Duty franchise, but for quite some time, arguably still, the biggest Battle Royale game in the entire gaming space. Today, we're taking a look at the complete timeline, the complete evolution of Warzone from even before day one to where we are now, 3 years after its launch. Drop your thoughts on what your favorite season, point, weapon, map, or mode was throughout the entire past 3 years, and if you're new to the channel, make sure you subscribe to stay today with all things Call of Duty related. And finally, make sure to check out my friends over at Gamer Advantage for the best blue light glasses on the market. Code Espresso getting you 10% off your entire order, link in the description. But let's jump into the history of Warzone. So let's start at the very beginning. September of 2019, players were able to jump in and play Modern Warfare 2019 for the very first time, and in weekend 2 of the open beta, players were able to jump into the largest scale combat that the franchise had seen to date. Ground War, a new take on large-scale combat in direct competition with Battlefield, 24v24 and upwards of 32v32. Now, did it truly compete on such a scale? That's subjective, but it was seemingly the goal of the mode. Our first introduction into that mode was a map called Karst River Quarry, a location that we know directly from Verdansk and what we'd see half a year later in a much larger scale. Later, we were introduced to locations like Tovorsk District, otherwise known as downtown Verdansk, Kravnik Farmland, and more as time progressed throughout the year. The interesting part, minus Karst River Quarry, was that each of these showcased the others in the outskirts of the map, which would be our first hint that we were playing in a connected world. For example, Tovorsk District, if you looked from the top of the skyscrapers, you could see places like the hospital, Kravnik Farmland, and the port of Verdansk, all on the outskirts of the map. Mix that in with the overlapping then use of the world in Spec Ops, and players immediately had their suspicions. It's one thing to reuse locations of the map, but another to see the whole world connected. I remember pre-release, I was at a capture event for press and media, and one of my teammates in our initial Spec Ops playthroughs was one of the heads of PR for Activision, and I made this lighthearted joke, this would be a perfect map for a Battle Royale, to which I was met with, I don't have a clue with what you're talking about. Not to mention, with all that included, a prominent data miner had at one point pulled just about every single asset that you could in regards to the upcoming Battle Royale, but still, mum was the word as it would be for a few months from the launch of the game all the way up until, well, Season 2. Season 2 of Modern Warfare 2 launched in February, bringing along with it a handful of new items for Modern Warfare 2019. The main marketed items, Ghost as an Operator, multiplayer maps of Rust, Atlas Superstore, Zokov Boneyard, and more in season. Notably missing, though, was Warzone of any kind. We look back and think, well, of course, it was coming, but at the time, we had no indication, especially officially. The only thing that we did have was the end of the cinematic for Season 2. We had to fly out from Verdansk International Airport to see the battle waging on, and a C-130 dropping players in, and what appeared to be gas off in the distance. It was also later added that we'd see a fifth slice added to the main menu, campaign, multiplayer, a new tab listed as classified, co-op, and the store. All of us then wondering, or rather knowing, but awaiting confirmation of what it would be. That's when we fast forward to March 9th, 2020, and the release of the official trailer for Call of Duty Warzone, introducing players to the new ways of play of Battle Royale as well as Plunder, and announcing the new era of Call of Duty, a free-to-play era of the franchise available the following day on March 10th. Now, what to this day is interesting to me is that we, again, really didn't have anything leading up to that, building up this anticipation of, hey, this mode's coming. Instead, it was a rather quick drop. The trailer on the 9th, the game launching on the 10th. Recently, we discussed the environment near day one, the gameplay style, metas, initial Easter eggs, and a retrospective, and we can echo it here. It was a different game, a different era. The gameplay was much slower, much more methodical. Players didn't realize the viability or even ways to maneuver the maps as they had done regularly in the past 3 years. Weapon builds were incredibly different. No matter what way you spun it, the game was just incredibly different than what we had been used to the last few years here, leading up to this point where we are today. A sort of simpler era. Some of the main air quote meta weapons, which by the way, at the time was everyone first discovering everything and learning the way to play, you could use any weapon. There was no real meta, but what's interesting is how different the balancing was. The M4 was a solid pick up and use weapon, but other things like the EBR were a air quote meta weapon that were two-shot. The AUG was pretty great. Thermals were a staple attachment for sniper loadouts. I'm telling you, man, it was a drastically different landscape. Season 2 and the launch also set up a bit of the upcoming storyline and the Easter eggs that were to follow with the inclusion of bunkers around the world, though not able to be opened opened, phones, laptops, and more that could be found were all hinting at something further, but we wouldn't know what that would be until a little later on. That's when we get to Season 3. That was our first big additions to the Warzone experience, naturally. With Season 2's launching the mode was a massive undertaking in and of itself, but in a condensed time frame that wasn't a full season, naturally we didn't get like a mid-season update or anything like that. However, with Season 3, we saw a handful of changes to Warzone, mainly the introduction of the bunkers in Plunder and Battle Royale. Now, there's layers to this, but the main marketed items talked about officially were the bunkers that you could access from the outside regions of the map. Bunkers inside tunnels and such were never opened, strangely, for the entire duration of Verdansk, but the ones that were outside on cliff faces and such could be opened, but all but one. For the ones that you could open, they were accessible by utilizing access cards that could be found in loot randomly, and all of them were interchangeable. It wasn't like an assigned card for a specific bunker. If you had one, you could go in and access it, and you'd be met with a ton of loot, a ton of cash, and more. However, these were really distractions. The decoys per se, as the one bunker that was really important was Bunker 11, located just north of Arklov military base on the outskirts of the map. This bunker had a generator next to it, and no matter how many key cards you got, you could not access it. Instead, we later found out this was part of the end goal of an Easter egg quest that you'd have to do. Simply put, there were phones around the map that once you found the start point, an activation phone if you will, it would play a distress call in Russian listing 3 numbers. Those numbers corresponded to specific phones around the map that you had to go and interact with in order, otherwise you'd break the code sequence. Through tons of trial and error, we figured it out, and once you completed all 3, you would go and interact with that Bunker 11 and open it up, and inside find a ton of high-level loot, story lore like a nuclear warhead, and even a reward for the Mudrobber MP7 that was credited to your account for completing the quest that you could use at any point in the future. That was an absolute thrill to find and do, and would be something that would be duplicated a few more times in Modern Warfare 2019 before kind of being an afterthought for the next few years. In addition to the Easter eggs, we didn't see any major map updates or anything like that alongside the bunkers, but we did see a gameplay feature introduced, the Armor Satchel, allowing for players to pick up and hold 8 armor pieces at a time, as opposed to the default 5. It may seem odd to consider since those are commonplace for so long, but for a time, armor satchels weren't around. You could only have max 5 armor plates. Personally, I think they made the game much better, and for those curious of what the meta looked like perhaps at this time, the dominant weapons included the Grau, one that would dominate for a while, the M13 for headshot multipliers, the MP7, AUG, M4, and HDR. The reign of the Grau was apparently underway right away. Season 4 introduced quite a bit though. It was the first season that didn't introduce a whole ton of map changes or anything like that. Nothing fancy or cool in the way of new bunkers, no Easter eggs. And I do remember in that regard, I looked back when it launched, many kind of thought it was a major negative for the season that we didn't see that kind of stuff, but it introduced a ton of things fundamentally that helped elevate the gameplay loop. Season 4 introduced a lot of gameplay events like fire sales, jailbreaks, supply choppers, and even contraband contracts, all of which having their own unique flair to the gameplay loop. Fire sales, of course, discounted items tremendously and made it a rapid dash to get to the buy stations around Verdansk. Sometimes that would lead to an ambush, sometimes it would yield some incredibly good deals for you and your squad. The jailbreak, this was an aggressive player's dream. Imagine you're on PR pace already and you see the jailbreak notification pop up, you may be foaming at the mouth, but both of those exist to this day in regards to the gameplay loop. Supply choppers, these were interesting because in Plunder, they'd shoot you back. Battle Royale, they just kind of create a ton of overhead noise and you could shoot them down for rewards and loot. Finally, those contraband contracts, they were extraction contracts similar to the Plunder cash deposits where you'd have to call in a helicopter, but you'd be rewarded with a rare and exclusive blueprint if you completed it that was on rotation for a little bit of time. If you didn't and you died, the enemies who killed you could then end up picking up that contract and start it for themselves, so a contract that transferred upon death. An interesting feature. Personally, I would love to see contraband contracts return as a rare skin enthusiast, but maybe some other day. Admittedly, while I said there wasn't much to the map, it wasn't devoid of any updates as we ended up seeing around the map we had new train tracks added, but strangely no train to go on it. That would come the following season, but it offered a pretty big hint as to what would be coming. For those curious about the progression of that meta, the MP5, Grau, M4, and the newly introduced CR56 AMAX were all killer weapons. Man, I miss the AMAX. We certainly had a decent number of solid weapons to choose from during that season, but Season 5, I think, was the first time that we really saw Warzone in full swing. We had major updates to the map, new Easter eggs, the first event that we'd see kick off, plenty of others to follow, as well as the first live event in Warzone's history, something that would only be replicated once more, but was a major experience when it was around for a limited time. Now, as for map updates to Verdansk, Season 5 saw the opening of a few different locations. The largest and most publicly marketed was the stadium just east of downtown Verdansk. something that had previously almost taken up a whole grid quadrant of the map of useless area. Unless you had a helicopter to get on top of Stadium, there was nothing that you could do and no way to counter by getting on top of it from the ground. In some instances, there was even final circles that would close in on the top of the stadium, so if you were on the ground, you would lose by default. But the stadium was finally opened up with playable areas including a lower level parking garage, the locker rooms and soccer or football pitch, the arena bleachers and concessions areas, as well as an upper administrative level. Another lesser advertised introduction to the existing map location was the introduction of the train station as a playable area just north of Promenade and south of Scrapyard. As with the stadium, this was as well an area previously that was inaccessible to the inside. While you could get on the roof, you also didn't see too many playable spaces beyond just the outside and above, but with this update, that changed all of that. One additional piece to that puzzle was that Season 5 finally introduced players to zip lines that we had seen become more and more common over the years since then, but previously, players were at the mercy of anyone who had the high ground. If you had a rooftop of a building, you only had to worry about one sort of stairwell that would lead up to that rooftop. But now, locations like the main skyscrapers, the stadium roof, they were no longer as safe because there were multiple zip lines and points of entry to cover. A nice step in combating excessive camping. The final map update that was introduced, of course, was that roaming train that went from the southern reaches of the map upwards of just north of Verdansk International Airport and then cut down through the map just before you go to downtown. A roaming train of loot and death, perhaps because if you stepped in front of it, you'd die instantaneously. But that roamed the southwestern portion of Verdansk with Season 5. Now, within Season 5, we saw another Easter egg where Season 4 didn't provide any, that being the Stadium Easter egg, which, in a nutshell, you had to find 3 key cards to access maintenance rooms in each of the levels of the stadium, and on their own, they each provided some cool items and high-level loot. Things like Specialist Bonus, which I think was the first introduction that we had of the Specialist Bonus tokens, an Advanced UAV, the Durable Gas Mask, and a ton of other cash and legendary items, but if you decided to go a step further, you'd have to match the PC code in each of those maintenance rooms to the conference room on the executive level. If you did all of that, you got in, got a free loadout drop, activated fireworks, and then even got an exclusive blueprint, the Enigma CR56 AMAX, one that I still think is one of the cleanest and better looking blueprints that we got here as a reward in all of Warzone. But beyond that, Season 5 introduced things like the Games of Summer, which was a bit more independent on the MP side, if I remember correctly, but it was also a seasonal event that would, unbeknownst to us, kick off what would be a relatively seasonal event every season update with challenges and rewards for completion. The final thing that was truly notable about Season 5 was the Black Ops Cold War live reveal event, where players could jump in, gather the clues, and get rewards along the way, but at the end, it debuted Black Ops Cold War in Warzone, culminating in an objective to run to the stadium for shelter as Verdansk was being bombarded, and once you reached there, you were met with the Black Ops Cold War reveal trailer. A pretty cool event. Many went in thinking it would be the almost like interactive Fortnite level events, but for COD, it wasn't half bad in my opinion. But that's Season 5. Well, and if you're keeping track of meta weapons, Season 5 was predominantly the Bruin. The FAL made an appearance as a sort of semi-auto SMG pocket build. The damage on that was pretty high if you had a fast trigger finger. The Grau, the MP5, Kilo, and for the snipers, the Kar 98K. How I missed that one so much. But that brings us to Season 6. Season 6 continued the finding its form, if you will, of Warzone, where I don't know that anyone would really call Season 6 bad. In fact, because of the haunting event, I've heard plenty say that it was the best of the seasons of Modern Warfare that main year of Warzone, perhaps even Warzone as a whole, but that's subjective. But let's start with the map updates for Verdansk in Season 6. Season 5 introduced a lot, but Season 6, while in quantity it didn't introduce as much, it offered a very new way to traverse the map by introducing the new subway stations, utilizing parts of the map that were already there, but adding functional trains underground that acted like a fast travel system on a set rotation. So unlike the train above ground, you wouldn't have to ride the thing the whole way. Instead, it would essentially teleport you to another station. This made it great for quick rotations if you were an aggressive player, or oppositely if you needed to leave an area fast, as well as just getting to A to B in as fast a manner as possible. One cool thing was that while it had a set rotation, there was a secret subway station that was only accessible through an Easter egg in Season 6. This tasked you with going to the Capitol building in downtown Verdansk, initiating a lockdown, and then locating pieces of paintings of the Capitol. Once you found the painting, you had to relay back to your partners the number of the painting that was found in, and once a sequence was input, you could unlock the subway system override, which would then allow you to go to any station of your choosing and then go to the maintenance station, which, once there, you were entirely on your own. No one could enter that station, as you could only do so by doing the Easter egg, and it was one of those places that was disconnected but also connected to the world of Verdansk, kind of like how gulags were. You couldn't access it from the standard map, but it existed in the map. Now that Easter egg upon completion would grant you with a ton of stuff from the station: specialist bonuses, advanced UAVs, juggernaut armor, durable gas masks, a new streak called Foresight, which gave you the knowledge of every single zone location upcoming in that match, and so on, but also including a new Easter egg blueprint reward of the Firebrand Bruin blueprint. So it was definitely worth doing. Now, perhaps the most notable part of the Season 6 offering was the Haunting of Verdansk event, a seasonal event that saw the first crossovers for COD in regards to cosmetics. We also saw new modes that brought zombies into the fold for Warzone and produced some cool jump scares, the introduction of Verdansk at night, and a whole host of other things. The Haunting became one of the first Warzone seasonal events, alongside all the modes, bundles, and other festivities produced a Halloween event tab, which tasked players with 16 challenges across the board in Warzone. All were rather easy, so you could collect the rewards with ease, but if you completed all 16, you were rewarded with an additional item, the Pumpkin Punisher Growl 556. The entire event was a ton of fun and became a near staple for the game, coming back in Black Ops Cold War. Now, Season 6 provided a ton of fun, but also a ton of questions for the future, as Black Ops Cold War's release was in Season 6, and with the impending integration of all Cold War weaponry, well, how would the Warzone ecosystem be affected? Well, spoiler alert, it didn't do too great. Not initially, at least, and for the weapon balancing category. But Season 1 of Black Ops Cold War brought along the first integration that we would see of 2 in the history of Warzone, the second coming a year later with Vanguard's integration, but we'll get there soon. Black Ops Cold War's integration meant a few things. On a smaller scale, we saw the inclusion of the new seasonal ranking system for Cold War transfer over to Warzone and Modern Warfare 2019. Beforehand, Modern Warfare 2019 introduced the seasonal ranking system, but there really wasn't much more to it than just simply 100 levels resetting every single season above that 55 that you'd see with your military ranks. Cold War in the ranking system allowed for seasonal prestiges, but also upwards of level 1000 per season. So that was retroactively changed for Warzone and thus Modern Warfare 2019 as well. But on a larger scale, of course, that meant porting over 50 plus weapons in all operations that we saw from the launch of Cold War, as well as what we saw with the introduction of Season 1's weaponry into the Warzone experience. Now, Cold War and Modern Warfare were two different variations of the COD engines, each studio not on a unified engine, so porting the game became somewhat of an issue, you could tell, because of the differences in feel from game to game. However, what was clearly a learning curve was the balancing. If you recall, things like the DMR, the AUG, the M16, and other weapons around the launch of the integration in Season 1, they were legitimately broken. Two shots over 50 to 100 meters and up for like the DMR could kill in some cases. That's just absurd. However, players had a massive amount of weapons that they could end up playing with at this point, bringing the total well over 100 in Warzone's offering. In addition to new weapons, players also had their first experiences with Rebirth Island, a repurposing of that Alcatraz map from Blackout and bringing that Resurgence game mode and pacing over to Warzone and the free-to-play experience. This map played drastically different in the first few months before the slide canceling meta really took over and became what we remember here out of the last couple of months before the launch of Warzone 2.0. But following the same story as Cold War canon, Rebirth Island was initially a Nova 6 production facility that tied directly into the backstories for Adler and Stitch, their shared history. It was a blast all around, however, and a nice deviation for those who may have gotten tired of the big map battle royale formula for Verdansk some 9 months or so earlier up until this point. In addition to the map itself, players were able to take part in the Rebirth event. Again, another seasonal introduction that tasked players with completing challenges for rewards, including an overall completion reward of the hazardous Krig 6 blueprint. Rebirth Island also surprisingly was the last introduction of a genuine Easter egg that we'd see for quite some time, something that personally I'm still a little salty about. I mean, you have the Black Ops franchise known for being mind-bending and having plenty of twists and turns, but you didn't utilize any of that for Easter eggs in Warzone, and it just felt like a major missed opportunity. However, this one tasked you with finding a briefcase of pictures of locations around the map, and you'd have to go to those locations, note the corresponding numbers etched on concrete or whatever wall was near it, then you'd have to go and put those together to make a combination code that unlocked a locked vault room, and once open, you had access to plenty of high-level loot as always, but also an exclusive blueprint called the Red Room Milano blueprint that would be up for grabs and again, be something you would end up getting on your accounts overall. Outside of the new map of Rebirth Island, Modern Warfare 2019's story officially came to a close, canonically at least. Throughout the year, Warzone intel missions were added periodically that players could follow along with, providing insight to the narrative as each week in Season went along. These directly previewed things like the Black Ops Cold War reveal, but as well, the larger narrative at hand. The final pieces of intel, once completed, rewarded players with a cutscene that showed Task Force 141 stopping the post-campaign baddie of Viktor Zakayev from launching the missiles out of Verdansk and enacting a possible World War III. From there, once thwarted, the team meets up on the dam and jumps down to survey the rest of Verdansk, with Soap confirmed to be off in the distance. Furthermore, in a playable space, we saw over the course of Season 1 that the map itself actually progressed a bit. We saw off in the distance a storm brewing in the southern waters of Verdansk and a ship slowly approaching Verdansk. Interestingly, it was also the ship that was previously off in the distance in Rebirth Island at the beginning of that season, the Vodianoi. This played a bigger part into what would come into Season 2, and that introduced a whole lot to Warzone's world, but also closed off quite a bit. Now, the main thing that was the marquee item of Season 2 was that ship of the Vodianoi. It wrecked off the shore just west of prison, and here this ship contained some Black Ops secrets, but was home to a semi-outbreak of zombies which would play a larger part in the story to come for that season. But the shipwreck surprisingly didn't offer a whole lot and tons of loot. I mean, it's a brand new point of interest, but really wasn't too worthwhile to go there as out of most rotations, and there really wasn't much loot to make it worthwhile. But the shipwreck did introduce zombies into Verdansk. An interesting part of this season, though, was the introduction of the underground bunkers as well, hidden in silos around the map where you'd have plenty of space to loot. You'd also see the containment consoles, which become more important as the season went on. You could actually use those as additional buy stations as the season went on, but it monitored the outbreak of zombies. Again, something that would be more useful as the season went on, but while we had a few areas open up, Warzone also put the Modern Warfare era to bed when they closed off the subway stations and made that fast travel system impossible to use, and they also walled off portions of the stadium, like the underground parking facilities. Now, of course, the football pitch still could be utilized and everything, but it walled off some of it. Strange, but it would make sense in time. Now, with Season 2, we saw the introduction of the Outbreak event, both a seasonal challenge-based event that tasked players with completing challenges for blueprint rewards, but also a progressive event that would happen in Warzone's Verdansk. Verdansk, every week or two, would end up having a new outbreak zone where players would have to be cautious of zombies in the area. Admittedly, though, it started out pretty terrible. It really didn't have anything that deterred players from going to those areas, and the spread was really slow. Throughout the weeks building up, we did get static messages talking about the rise in containment protocol levels and to please be advised with missiles starting to fly through the air. But in that final week, however, that's when things really started to pick up. That's when there were multiple outbreak zones and the zones would spread, culminating in the need to nuke Verdansk, to wipe it clean of the zombies outbreak. That produced a real in-game event, a two-parter even, one on the last day of Season 2 and one on the first day of Season 3. Now, the first part of that, you'd have to try and escape from the zombie horde in exfil, but spoiler alert, you never could. This produced a cutscene that we saw the launch of the nuke into Verdansk, and we left off on a sort of cliffhanger until the next day with the nuke mushroom cloud going up. And if you'd taken part in this, you ended up getting a reward of a calling card, but coming back the next day to the Season 3 launch, that was the bigger part, because that was the destruction of Verdansk Part 2, which saw you on Rebirth Island and an event that stated that Verdansk was overrun, taking place 10 minutes before the destruction of Verdansk, which strangely was set at night. One detail I found kind of odd considering that the Verdansk nuke event was set during the day, but you were tasked with being the ones to launch the nukes, retrieving the device and then setting it off, which once completed, whoever did it, you won, but it also prompted a whole cutscene that introduced Verdansk 84 and even dropped you into the map immediately after your first match of play, which I thought was a really cool transition. It allows players to be that immersive experience, see what they ended up doing as a result of that event, but a seamless transition into your very next match. Now, Verdansk 84 was kind of a new map, not really, but there were a decent amount of changes that made it something that felt fresh. Points of interest and other changes that were Call of Duty's attempt at marketing a new map, but overall it wasn't. But the biggest parts of this were the thematic change. You could tell Verdansk was straight out of the Cold War in this version. Superstore was concrete, the 80s aesthetic everywhere. It was spruced up quite differently. Additionally, some points of interest were entirely changed. I mean, the dam in the north of Verdansk was replaced with Array, a compound up on a sort of set of major cliffs. Factory was added between Superstore, hangars, and block. The Duga radar array was added just north of TV that created quite a fly risk for helicopters, and Stadium was opened up almost entirely because, well, it was still under construction. So it was a much different landscape while being familiar as well. And one thing that I personally didn't like was the addition of a reddish-orange hue to everything. Wasn't a fan of that. That ended up being removed in a later season, but it's what they did also with Season 1 and the introduction of Rebirth. They even did that in the menus in Season 1, which was, again, frustrating. But Season 3 was unique, where we actually had two seasonal events, one of which you may entirely forget about, however, because the first, it launched with Season 3, it was the Hunt for Adler event, an event that tasked players with doing a few challenges to get an exclusive Adler skin for the season. However, if you don't remember it, don't worry, because it only lasted 2 weeks, I believe, and it was incredibly problematic in the way the challenges didn't track, so much so to the point that eventually every player was just gifted that skin, whether they completed or even attempted the challenges or not, because they were like, we'll get them next time. Which, thankfully, at the mid-season, we saw a much better event. The 80s Action Heroes event, including classic action movies of Die Hard and Rambo. On top of cosmetic crossover, players were able to see changes to Verdansk overall, in which we had the survivor camps as mini outposts, we had the CIA bunkers, we had Nakatomi Plaza added into downtown Verdansk, which replaced the under-construction skyscraper. That one, to this day, still kind of perplexes me because it was kept after Season 3 even, so we had this variation to Verdansk with the skyscraper that was under construction, a major asset that was built for Warzone, but only playable for like 4 or 5 weeks. It's one of like 2 or 3 times in Warzone's history where I feel like something was made that just doesn't get its due. But either way, Nakatomi Plaza was pretty cool, and it provided a sort of mini Easter egg, a way to access the Nakatomi Vault in 3 different challenge formats. 1 to disarm C4 on the rooftop, 1 to clear the parking garage in the lower levels, and 1 to just simply complete a scavenger contract on each of the accessible floors of Nakatomi Plaza. Each completion rewarded players with a certain safety deposit box key, offering rewards like cash, an advanced UAV, and then specialist bonus as the 1, which was a massive deal because you could get that for your entire team. It spat out 1 per player depending on the team sizing in Battle Royale, so it made for a great number of like boosts to your early game here, which was awesome, I thought. Now, Season 4 was interesting because it reintroduced quite a few features that were taken away from the Cold War chapter of Warzone, but also introduced new Warzone items as well. On the scale of map updates, we saw things like these satellite crash locations. This, the ground fall event as per the seasonal theme. Stitch was ending up crashing these satellites into Verdansk. The ground fall event would be something that we'd see in regards to, again, additional challenges, additional rewards, but the updates to the map itself, they proved to be lootable locations. Satellite crashes proved to be like sort of recon style contracts where it would give you one of 2 different rewards for wherever you ended up capturing this, either a harp or a loadout drop marker for entirely free. Now, the difference between advanced UAVs and harps was subtle, but they essentially did the same thing, but not entirely. Advanced UAVs were still a little bit better. They showed ghosted players on your mini and tac map, but they lasted for a shorter duration as opposed to the harps. The harps lasted longer, but didn't show ghost. So if you found a harp, it wasn't exactly the same as previous advanced UAVs that we had seen, but it was something introduced no less, and a really nice way to sort of start an aggressive early game if we wanted to do that. Now, additionally, we saw the new red door feature, which, if you think about it, again, coming back to how they removed and then re-added some stuff, this was one of those features because it's a fast travel system that would allow you to teleport to various different areas around the map. This one a little bit harder to predict. You'd actually have to study which red door locations would teleport you where, as opposed to a subway station in Modern Warfare's manual of support just telling you where you'd go, but that was something that was added in as well. Now, the ground fall event, again, was something that kind of capped this off and gave you a little bit more to do. And finally, in regards to Season 4, we saw custom mod support for Cold War weapons, where you could save your blueprints with relative ease, and then you could just re-equip that custom blueprint as opposed to having to put your attachments on every single time. Now, honestly, that was really about it for Season 4. It was a much smaller season by comparison to others, but again, being that it was something that just followed a major map change in Season 3, 2 major seasonal events, it was something that some people kind of understood, but when we got back to Season 5, that's when things started to pick back up once again. Season 5 introduced a handful of different updates, a new event, something that was a little bit more delayed in a sense because a lot of people thought this would be coming at season launch, that being the numbers event, but that actually came at mid-season. But what's odd is that the parts to that actually started to come into the game at the beginning of the season. The new mobile broadcast stations were there, but not usable until that mid-season. So for the first couple of weeks, it was something that was marketed, but was kind of useless until that launch at mid-season. At mid-season, though, it was something that gave cash to those who activated it. So just a quick little boost here for players. We ended up seeing that also there was an update to that red door fast travel system. This time, it didn't just drop you in a room anymore with specific loot and a sort of locked off area elsewhere in the map. Instead, it took you to a corridor of red doors that takes you to different locations, really giving you the option to choose where you wanted a little bit further. Season 5 also introduced 2 new perks for the first time within Warzone: Combat Scout and Tempered. Combat Scout giving players red pings on players that end up taking damage from them, and Tempered offering the ability to have 250 HP in terms of health, but only through 2 plates rather than 3. So it's something that will allow you to get back up to full armor health in less time as opposed to if you didn't have that. Now, come mid-season, we end up seeing the numbers event once again, a new seasonal event with a few challenges, and then eventually the overall completion reward for that was the unlock of the Psy melee weapon. So not a camo, not a blueprint, nothing like that, but instead a base melee weapon, something that was cool, but also maybe not what everybody may have hoped for. Additionally, in Season 5, we also saw zombies camos of Dark Ether and all the likes finally added into Warzone. With the integration for Cold War Season 1 and Warzone, you of course had all your multiplayer camos, your DM Ultra, but your zombies camos were notably absent for a long time. And if you guys remember, a lot of people were really upset about that, but it took until Season 5 to end up getting that, 268 days after the announcement of the zombie camo delay for Warzone, something that was mentioned pre-Season 1. So almost a whole year later it took to get that. But anyways, that was something that was added with this as well. And the final thing in Season 5 was, again, similar to Modern Warfare 2019, was the Vanguard official reveal event. The Battle of Verdansk saw players having to stop a train from the World War II era on the tracks within Verdansk. And then once they did, well, then an air bombardment came in and knocked players out, and then ended up showcasing that global reveal trailer for Call of Duty Vanguard, the last live event that we saw within Warzone, since Modern Warfare 2 did not see any sort of event actually happen at that point. So that was the culmination of Season 5 and everything that was really notable of that. Now, Season 6 of Cold War, the last season here for the Black Ops Cold War era, was something that actually added quite a bit in regards to playable changes, map changes, events, and all things. It was really a sort of coup de grace of the Cold War era, and it was a pretty good one if you ask me. For map changes, we saw map fissures added in, cracks throughout Verdansk, downtown, stadium, near hospital, the hills below the radio tower. The map was drastically altered in a story version where Adler, sort of under the trance of Stitch, went on this sort of rogue destruction of Verdansk and was somebody that was planting bombs all around in the underground portions here. But as a result of that in the story and narrative, we saw the introduction of bunkers in Verdansk along with those map fissures and the collapse of downtown. These 3 bunkers were found around the map, and they were old World War II bunkers, again tying into the storyline here that we'd see a transition from Cold War to the Vanguard era and that connected narrative. Now, each one of these, there were loot in them, decent starting locations, but there was no Easter egg alongside with those, unfortunately. In Season 6, the OG Gulag also returned here as a sort of one final hurrah for Verdansk, because we knew that we'd be getting a brand new map at this point for the Vanguard era of Warzone. Now, at its base, Season 6 and the map changes and everything like that were really all that we saw in terms of fundamental gameplay changes, but Season 6 was really the season of events. We had the Haunting event coming back here once again for Modern Warfare 2019, having its own spin on the sort of zombie royale that we saw in Modern Warfare 2019, but not exactly the same in Black Ops Cold War. We had the Secrets of the Pacific event, we had Operation Flashback, and the Last Hours of Verdansk, all as celebrations of the final bits of Verdansk and the playable time we'd have on it. The Last Hours of Verdansk was the final event, and it was the only playable playlist for Verdansk from the 6th to the 8th, and marked the end of Verdansk. If you won, you got an exclusive Final Victor calling card, and at the very end, if you stayed, you get a cutscene that previewed the next stop in the Warzone era, Caldera. And that's something that we can then move now over into Vanguard Season 1, the quite literally biggest change to Warzone that we had ever seen up until this point. Caldera was a brand new map, a brand new world. Goodbye, Verdansk. Punch your ticket, because we're going out to the Pacific. We're becoming island boys. It was all new terrain, locale, and a world to explore. For better or for worse, we got a whole new world with it. Now, the Vanguard weapons integration was something that, well, just like Black Ops Cold War, is pretty problematic. Weapon balancing was pretty much a mess, and honestly, one of the big things that was about the Season 1 Vanguard launch and that Warzone sort of era was that it was quite literally broken. The downside here to this was that it launched right before the holidays, Christmas as well as New Year's, and that was something that at that point, the studios that support the game go on holiday for like 3 to 4 weeks at a time. And that is something that is unfortunately where all the problems flared up. So players had broken games for multiple weeks at a time. That was something that was incredibly buggy and eventually caused Season 2 to be delayed. Now, looking past that, but still acknowledging it, talking about the rest of what Season 1 offered, of course, we had all our weapons from Vanguard, massively bolstering out the total number of weapons that you have on offer throughout the Warzone experience between Modern Warfare 2019, Black Ops Cold War, as well as Vanguard. And initially, we actually had Vanguard Royale modes only, where you could just play with Vanguard weaponry. We had planes and new vehicles, we had fundamental changes. The loadout change was the first time ever where you could not buy a loadout first before that first loadout event. UAVs were also increased in price, so we saw some fundamental differences and changes here with the Caldera era. But some of those were reverted, some of them not so much. But we saw the Festive Fervor event in Season 1 as well, which brought along, well, everybody's favorite Krampus, but I don't really want to talk about him too much. Still have some PTSD for that. But anyways, Season 1, big changes for better or for worse. I think maybe looking back, it was something that offered up a lot, but wasn't quite executed very well. Now, Season 2 for Vanguard and that Caldera era was something that Raven fully acknowledged, hey, we messed up, we got a lot of work to do here, we're going to fix this, don't worry. But whenever you got past that sort of technical rebuilding of a sense, we saw a lot happen in Season 2 in regards to map updates, events, and things like that. In Season 2 for Caldera, we saw a new point of interest of Factory. We saw the new points of interest of the underground bunkers, not specifically located, but located in relative vicinity to the yellow circle marks on the TAC map that players would have, both having higher level loot and the introduction of new items. We saw Nebula 5 rounds introduced, replacing stopping power, the PDS, which was a new gas clearing device, kind of like a trophy system for repelling the actual gas itself. We had new armored convoys that, like the train of Verdansk, would roam in static routes. Players could shoot at this and destroy it for high level loot and tons of cash. We saw Nebula 5 bombs, and we also saw the new redeploy balloons that were added in to easily and quickly traverse the map. Search and Deploy was an event that was not actually an event. We saw the seasonal event of Rebirth Reinforced come a little bit later on down the line, which is where the other segment of Season 2 came along. Rebirth Reinforced was a rework slightly of Rebirth Island, a newish aesthetic, but also extending the map in the southern portions, where we saw an entirely new point of interest called Stronghold added, and we saw 2 ships added in the northern and southern portions of the map. We saw new bunkers added in. We saw new weapon trade stations and communication towers added in, which offered up loot for weapons you could trade in. If you wanted to troll enemies, you could quickly pick up their weapons, which would be probably high level because they were custom, and get loot for that they couldn't come back and re-loot. And the communication towers were single ping UAVs. We also saw with that the Rebirth Reinforced event, which was a community-based set of challenges that unlocked weekly, but with additional individual challenges that, if completed, rewarded players with the Toxic Heavy blueprint. Then we also saw the Golden Vault Easter egg, one of my favorite parts of the Season 2 offering, which tasked players with turning on TVs in the cell block of Rebirth Island. Once you did, the phone would ring, you pick that up. It would then be a sequence that was repeated back to you that you could end up having to go to any of the Golden Vaults and input. That code worked for all 3 vaults, but once in, you could end up getting loot and even the Wall Riot Shield blueprint, our first Easter egg blueprint that we had for quite some time within Warzone. So that was Season 2. A lot was definitely on offer, and it was a rebuilding period for Warzone after the Caldera mess that was Season 1, but it was something that introduced quite a bit to the experience. Now, Season 3 is where Raven and the Vanguard era of Warzone kind of tried to have a bit more fun with stuff. It didn't take itself so seriously, and we saw, well, what would be eventually Operation Monarch. So what was previewed from, I think, even the beginning of the season was Kong versus Godzilla, something that for Call of Duty, that's pretty crazy and out there, but it's a crossover that we did end up getting. For Caldera with Season 3, we ended up seeing a number of different changes. Firstly, a new skybox. It proved to be darker and a gloomier version of Caldera, something that was actually kind of a nice aesthetic here if you weren't somebody that really liked overly bright atmospheres. We saw a new point of interest of the dig site, again, kind of in conjunction with that Operation Monarch event. We saw updated locations of Runway, Peak, and Lagoon, Peak being one of those locations that would go through a handful of different changes here as the seasons went on. Then we ended up seeing a new Gulag area. We saw a new Sabotage contract. We saw an additional perk finally added into the Warzone experience, that being Serpentine, one that definitely made a splash as a controversial perk, we'll say. We saw a new underground transit system of the minecart system. So again, what we had with the subway stations in Verdansk, the original, what we had with the red doors in Verdansk 84, and then also again within Caldera, acting the exact same way. We had new lootable items added in with Season 3 that honestly changed the gameplay fundamentally, and I think for the better. We had lootable perks, firstly rolling out with just a handful. Over the next couple of seasons, we ended up seeing that all of the perks would be added in as lootable perks. Then we had Gulag entry and redeploy tokens, so you could end up having another shot at the Gulag if you died and came back, or if you had a redeploy token, you'd skip that entirely. We also saw the new speed boost sort of effect as a lootable item as well. And finally, we saw a field upgrade of the radar jammer. Now, Operation Monarch again was that key item here that we saw within Season 3, and it was something that was pretty whimsical, pretty funny. We had a limited time mode where you'd end up having to battle Kong and Godzilla, or at least stay out of their way. We had different devices that could use their effects to our advantage, or if an enemy had it, to our detriment. So it was definitely interesting, but the overall Kong versus Godzilla Operation Monarch event was a 2-week event that allowed also for a seasonal challenge set of 8 challenges to be completed that, if completed on all of those, players would receive the Ancient Rivalry blueprint. So it was a season that kind of had a little bit more fun with everything on a more whimsical nature, but then we move over into Season 4. Vanguard Season 4 was actually, looking back at it, probably one of the more stacked seasons we've had in Warzone, just by sheer offering of everything that we got from a fundamental level, from the events and all things. So the very beginning, the big thing with Vanguard Season 4 was a brand new map of Fortune's Keep, a whole new world to explore, new small map that for a while lived in tandem with Rebirth Island. on that in particular, we had new black market contracts, we had cash extraction public events, and realistically looking back, on top of mastering an entire new world, a new small resurgence-based map, it's kind of wild to me that we saw so many major adjustments, not only just Rebirth Island a couple of seasons before, but also introducing a whole small-scale map like this, only for it to be removed some 5 months or so later. But we also had the Mercenaries of Fortunes event launch alongside this, which was a seasonal event that brought along with it a handful of challenges, but for once, actually, the completionist reward wasn't too worthwhile a whole ton. It was a vehicle skin, but along the way for the individual challenges, players were able to earn 2 universal camos. The first time that we saw that within Warzone instead of just blueprints. Something we've seen a handful of times since then, and we'll see again here in the next few days with the mid-season update for Season 2 Reloaded of Modern Warfare 2 and the Path of the Ronin challenge refreshes. But you were able to earn the False Prospector and the Death Prospector camos in that event. For the Caldera changes, we saw the new points of interest of Storage Town and the Mercenary Vaults introduced. So some changes, but not really obviously the main focus as launching a brand new map here at this. Overall, we saw new changes of the portable redeploy balloons being added in, we saw the EMP grenade being added in, and we saw those weapon trade stations that debuted in Rebirth Island finally coming over to Fortune's Keep as well as Caldera from that Rebirth experience. Zombies camos were also finally added in as well, something that just like Black Ops Cold War was on a multiple month delay here to the second to last season of the content offering. So a little unfortunate, but finally added in. Then we saw throughout the season the Titanium Trials event, which was in a gameplay format a variation of Iron Trials, but in regards to a seasonal event, it was another set of seasonal challenges that was themed around the Terminator, where we saw another crossover as we did with Season 3, as we did with things like the Haunting of Verdansk and other things in the past. But the Titanium Trials event was actually pretty cool because it offered a few universal camos, bringing the total on the season to 5. One was a challenge for the Titanium event that you could do individually. Another was a completionist reward for completing all the challenges of the Titanium Trials seasonal event. But then there was a secret challenge to get 20 wins in the Titanium Trials playlist in the mere 2 weeks that it was around. But if you did that, you got a secret camo of the Skynet camo. So a true grinders camo for sure. We also saw on a smaller event side of things, the Rebirth of the Dead event, which wasn't a replacement for a dedicated Halloween mode. We didn't see that within Vanguard, but in the summer, we saw a sort of zombie royale style mode for Rebirth, which if you hadn't completed the golden vaults, one thing that was pretty cool about this was that the vaults were open just by themselves. So you could walk into the one in the underbelly of the Nova 6 factory and get that The Wall blueprint for the riot shield for nothing. It was open by default. You just have to kill some zombies that would attack you if you went in there. But that was Season 4, honestly, pretty hefty season overall. Now, Season 5 was, well, it was essentially the beginning of the end. The content itself wasn't as heavy in regards to Season 5's offering. Raven began shifting their support to the upcoming Warzone 2.0 experience, and that was pretty apparent. We all knew that we'd be seeing an end of Caldera, Fortune's Keep, and Rebirth at that time, so really, we just saw a whole host of things that looked to have fun with the final season of Warzone 1. For Caldera, we saw some points of interest changed, Peak being the main one here, where that turned into an active volcano with much more buildup on the POI, where there was much more to the lower areas, more to the compound overall, as it was the Task Force Tyrant's headquarters. The classic Gulag from Verdansk returned. The Doomsday Station was added, which would give a ton of valuable items to those who took the cash to do it and the time to defend it against the AI and potentially other players. It would reward players with things like Specialist Bonus, 1 per player, streaks like Foresight, and I think you could get an advanced UAV out of it, as well as other items like standard UAVs and things like that. So it was a way to set yourself up nicely if you had the chance to do it. But we also saw playlist rotations of classic Iron Trials, Champions of Caldera, Operation Last Call, and a few other things that really played on the nostalgia of what we saw the past year, but also sometimes even the overall Warzone experience since the beginning. But that was the last of our Warzone 1 experience. At a time when players weren't fond of Caldera, when they were wanting Vanguard's year to be over, players started to look towards what was next. Now, a few weeks into Season 5, players did see their first look, and creators like myself got a little hands-on to share with Warzone 2 via COD Next and the global reveal of Modern Warfare 2. But for better or for worse, it was a drastically different game and feel from what we saw initially at COD Next to even what we have right now. It's a much more slowed down in pace, changes to fundamentals and looting requiring a backpack, that being something that changed with Season 2, the ability to use an inventory space however you saw fit. You could carry 30 plates if you had a large backpack at the time of launch, or you could carry none. You could carry 5 or more self-reses, or you could carry none. You could carry multiple stacks of 210 rifle ammo, or you could carry none. It really all came down to how you wanted to play. But you also had a plenty number of different fundamental changes as well. I mean, loadout drops were no longer really a thing when Warzone launched in Season 1. They were, but not really. You had to buy guns instead of loadouts. There were no perks initially, and then at launch with a singular loadout drop of like 5 once per match, it was a free-for-all on who could get them, and you'd very well be ambushed because they were not team-specific. Streaks were limited per buy station. Buy stations were changed so that not every single item was in every single buy station. Vehicles had limited fuel and could be rehealed, so you can see at launch with Season 1 of Warzone 2.0, it was a very different gameplay experience. Again, for better or for worse. Some people love that, some not at all. So it's been a very polarizing launch of Warzone 2.0 and what we've seen so far to round out the start of the 3rd year of Warzone, but it is something that's been there for sure. Now, Season 2 brought back a little bit of staples, changing some of the fundamentals, and also introducing Resurgence here as something that, honestly, I would have guessed would have been something held off for later on down the line. There was a leak recently that suggested we see a small map in Season 4 of Modern Warfare 2, but small map usually refers to a Warzone experience, not a multiplayer experience. And if that's the case, I wouldn't be surprised if that was moved up here as this Ashika Island map being that small map to mitigate some of the differences in play that many players weren't too fond of. With Season 2, we got that. We've seen the introduction of new weapons, but our weapon pool is, again, much smaller by comparison to the last 3 years that we saw within Warzone. So right now, it is a very different experience. It is something that is a 2.0 era. Some would argue maybe a 0.5 era, where this feels kind of like the prequel to Warzone 1, but the evolution of Warzone is something that we have come to a head right now. A mid-season update coming as of next week, adding in a couple of more things, changing some fundamentals in regards to weapon balancing, and some audio that was recently adjusted as well. But that is where Warzone has been the last 3 years since March 10th of 2020. It's been a crazy 3 years when you think about it, and honestly, it's gone by incredibly fast. So that said, that's what we're going to call it. So let me know your thoughts down below. What was your favorite moment out of the last 3 years of Warzone? If you've made it this far, honestly, truly, I love you guys. This is absolutely a video essay, something that is the Warzone movie, as somebody put it in last year's version here of this, but had a blast making this, looking back at the past. So let me know your thoughts down below. If you enjoyed the video, do me a favor and drop a like on it. And if you're new to the channel, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss a single thing on all things Modern Warfare 2, Warzone 2, and anything COD related upcoming. Some retrospective looks back at the past of Warzone as well upcoming. If you're interested in any of that, make sure that subscribe button so you don't miss a single thing. But for now, thanks so much for watching. Modest Man Espresso. Been a crazy 3 years, man. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you later. Take care and peace.